This is Simple Politics with Kim Wehle, and I want to welcome my guest and colleague at University of Baltimore, Dean Ron Weich, to the program. Thank you, Ron, for being on with us tonight.
I'm honored. I've admired what you've done with this platform, Kim, and I'm really glad to be a part of it and to share whatever expertise or insights I might have.
Well, I was just telling the people that have joined that the filibuster is looming very large again. I think you wrote about it several years ago in the Baltimore Sun. I have a piece today in the Hill where I quoted you. And so I think it's really important, as you know, this show is about breaking basic, complex concepts down into simple language. So I think it's important for people to understand what it is and why it matters so much. It sounds like this kind of lofty technical legal term, but it really has a critical role to potentially play in terms of getting legislation moving forward with this Democratic, House, Senate, presidency. So can you explain what is it and where does it come from? Is it a law?
No, it's part of the Senate rules. And it dates way back. It goes back to the early 19th century. As you spoke about in your piece in the Hill today, the Senate has this long tradition of unlimited debate. It was seen as a deliberative body. They've long prided themselves on being called the world's greatest deliberative body. And for the longest time, there was simply no mechanism to cut off debate. If a senator wanted to go on, he or she just went on. At some point, they realized that that was untenable, and they created in Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate the concept of cloture, which is really closure, but the fancy word is cloture. And in the early days, it was a 2/3 threshold. So in the current 100-member Senate, that would be 67. And then in the early 70s, that was seen as too high a hurdle. And so they changed 2/3 to 3/5. So it's now 60 votes to cut off debate.
Okay, so I'm sorry to interrupt, just to back up just a second. So first of all, what is the normal threshold to get legislation passed? And secondly, why would someone debate? Is it because these legislation has historically been so controversial? Like, why would you need this filibuster mechanism to stop debate? Wouldn't it just naturally stop, like in our regular lives?
Well, so the answer to your first question is that, as in most legislative bodies, majority rules. Now, the Senate is a funny body when you talk about the majority because obviously the senators don't represent the same number of constituents. So you have 2 senators from Wyoming, just like you have 2 senators from California. So at any one time, a majority of senators might represent a minority of Americans. But that's still the basic rule, is that 51 votes in a 100-member body carries the day. When there is debate, it might be because the issue is especially important. It might be, for example, that a member wants to call attention to the issue and over time rally people to his side. On the other hand, it may be to obstruct, it may be to prevent the bill from passing. The cloture rules contemplate that eventually there'll come a time when the debate should end and there would be a majority vote. But in recent years, it's become more common for senators to insist on that 60-vote threshold. In fact, it's gotten to the point where if a senator simply says, I'm going to debate, they stop considering the bill until there are 60 votes lined up. So it's become abused. It's subject to abuse.
So back in the old days, back in the early 1800s when it started, we were talking about people literally just like doing a talkathon all night long, right?
Sure. It's classic. Some of your audience, some of your followers may remember Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Jimmy Stewart plays a senator who collapses from exhaustion because he's debating a bill about the boys club back in his home state. That's sort of a classic. And it's interesting that that's in popular culture because that was seen as a very admirable thing that character did to stop some corrupt bill from moving through. For many years, that was seen as noble.
And so at some point, they collapse from exhaustion. At some point, does the time run out for a vote, which is why the filibuster functions? That is, if you just keep talking, eventually there's just no time left. You run out the clock for a vote. Is that how it works prior to cloture?
There is no clock. So in fact, the minority can stop a bill from moving forward. And in current practice, they don't even require debate. They just file the cloture petition, and either there are 60 votes or not. One of the
so you would
reforms-
just, so in the old days, it was like people would just be like, listen, I'm hungry, I want to go home. So we'll just cave. And now, and so that was, to some degree, you said, you talk about Jimmy Stewart, love, love, love. I'm sure some of our young law students who are following don't know who he is. But if I mean, the other one you have to watch, right, Ron, is It's a Wonderful Life. I used to use that in my classes, and I don't anymore because people don't remember it. But so now, so the idea is, okay, in the old days, as my kids would say, you would have to have someone like James Stewart have the wherewithal and the stamina to just talk all night till they're exhausted. That was the hurdle they'd have to overcome to trigger the filibuster. But at some point, they don't even have to pay that anymore. That is, right. There's no downside, right? What's the downside to just saying, listen, I'm going to ask for a 60 vote, a 60. So
right.
there's.
The downside is you can be called an obstructionist. Somebody might block your bill if you're blocking their bill. But there's been too little cost. I think one of the abuses is that people have resorted to the filibuster without having to stand up and speak at length.
So right now, so as you indicate, so right now, even though it's a simple majority, technically it's really turned into a supermajority.
Yes.
Okay, so I have a couple questions on that. I want to get back to this notion of a Senate that's not representative, because I think it's something people don't really understand. I know that you're also on record as sort of a pro-filibuster person. And are there examples historically where what happened with Jimmy Stewart actually happened in real life that shows the benefits of a filibuster, where
yes.
there was something really ugly that was stopped with a filibuster that would have
yes.
hurt Americans and hurt voters?
Yeah, and here I'm gonna talk about history. We're not gonna go back to Jimmy Stewart, but I'm gonna talk about somewhat recent history, certainly within our lifetimes, Kim, and within my professional experience. So I worked in 1995 for Senator Ted Kennedy. He won his reelection in 1994, but it was a wipeout for Democrats. And Democrats lost both the House and the Senate. And a firebrand named Newt Gingrich came in as Speaker of the House with a promise to enact what he called a contract with America. And he passed in the first several weeks of that Congress many radical bills that, among other things, would have seriously impaired the ability of the Environmental Protection Agency to do its work and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It was under the rubric of something they called regulatory reform, and we called regulatory deform. But it passed the House like a knife through warm butter, and it came to the Senate, and we weren't at all confident that President Clinton, was president at the time, would veto the bill. He was triangulating at the time and was tilting a little bit right. And Senator Kennedy and colleagues filibustered that bill and did stay up for hours and hours debating it, taking turns debating it, and defeated that bill and other elements of the contract with America. Fast forward to 2005. I went back to the Senate to work for Senator Harry Reid. George W. Bush had just been reelected, and he had an agenda to privatize Medicare, Social Security, and he was going to completely restructure Medicaid in a way that would have shredded the safety net for poor people in this country. And the only reason those proposals didn't get through was because Senator Reid led what was then 45 Democrats in a filibuster. So I can tell you from my experience, the filibuster has stopped some very bad notions. Even in these past 4 years of the Trump administration, Senator Schumer has led a filibuster on some key items. Believe me, President Trump wanted the filibuster to go away so that he could repeal the Affordable Care Act and build his border wall and do other things that he wanted to do. And we've seen a rehearsal. Let me say one more thing, and
yeah.
I'm not filibustering, I promise.
No, it's all fascinating.
But we've also seen a bit of a kind of a glimpse into what a post-filibuster world looks like, because, as you know, Senator Reid ultimately did eliminate the filibuster for nominations in 2013. And over the last 4 years, President Trump got the cabinet that he wanted, including some pretty unqualified or not so attractive people in the cabinet. And he got more than 200 judges, including 3 Supreme Court justices. I don't know about you, Kim, but one of the worst moments of my life was watching the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett in the last days of the Congress, mere weeks after Justice Ginsburg had died. And the Democrats could do nothing about it because they lacked the filibuster.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was amazing about that in part is that when people don't understand, I mean, those jobs are for life. Worst case scenario, even with a 51% or a 51 majority, killing good legislation, passing bad legislation, the American public can push back, re-elect a different Senate. But the Supreme Court's there for life, and there are three justices that really didn't have any Democratic representation in the Senate. And they're there deciding our futures, our fates, the fates of our children, with no electoral accountability whatsoever. But my question is, so Harry Reid was your boss for a long time. Were you against it at that point? Did you tell your boss,
So
listen, bad idea?
the history through all of this. So I worked for him in the early 2000s, and in 2005,
you weren't there.
when the Republicans were trying to do this to speed George W. Bush's judicial nominees, Reid fought the nuclear option, and that matter was resolved by a bipartisan group. They were called the Gang of 14, 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats, who came together and said, we will only use the filibuster in extraordinary circumstances, but we want the filibuster to remain. And that diffused the nuclear option at that time. I was gone from the Reid staff when he changed his position in 2013.
So the nuclear option, just so our viewers, that has to do with the rules governing the filibuster itself.
Right.
So can you explain?
Sure.
I mean, this again, so people understand, this is not law. It's not in a statute. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in some Supreme Court decision. It's not even in a regulation. This is the Senate's rules of how it functions.
And of course, the Constitution, as you well know, Kim, you've written the book on the Constitution. The Constitution says that the Senate and the House can determine the rules of procedure in each body. So this is how the Senate does it. So Rule 22, which is the rule that says that to cut off debate, you need 3/5 or 60 votes, says that if you want to change the rules of the Senate, that still requires 2/3. It was meant to be that there would be broad bipartisan consensus for changing the rules. What someone figured out, a fellow by the name of Marty Gold, who was a Republican parliamentarian, figured out, was that when a rule would be challenged and the chair would rule, for example, that debate was in order on a nomination, someone could appeal the ruling of the chair, and an appeal of the ruling of the chair is settled by a majority of the body. So it was a way of getting around Rule 22 to let a simple majority change the rules of the Senate. It had happened in some minor ways in previous years, but the big threat was when the Republicans wanted to do it in 2005, and then Senator Reid did it in 2013. Now, then Senator McConnell followed to confirm Justice Gorsuch over a Democratic filibuster. He changed the rule with respect to Supreme Court nominations. So
right, and blamed Harry Reid, right?
He did.
He did.
Well, this
right?
is, it's the Hatfields and the McCoys.
Yeah.
With respect to judicial nominations especially, but really on all of this, where they point a finger and say, you started it, no, you started it. It's all ugly. But I say this, it's a real kind of downward spiral in the way in which the Senate is supposed to operate. And I know it sounds naive and old-fashioned to talk about bipartisanship and common ground, but I'd like to see us try and get back to that. And when the 50-50 Senate, it might be the time to do that.
So a number of questions. First of all, say the Democrats follow your advice, and which I think, it would be a big maelstrom politically for them to use the nuclear option to get rid of the filibuster for basic legislation.
Well, can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
It'd be very difficult for them to do it because at least 2 of the current 50 members of the Democratic Senate are on record against it. Senator Manchin of West Virginia, Senator Sinema of Arizona, and there are others who are troubled. So I think this is a little bit abstract. I don't think Democrats have the votes to change the filibuster rules as of now. Okay,
so let's fast forward for a few months though, and assume we've got filibusters in the Senate, and we have some pretty pretty radical people in the Senate. If you look at January 6th and Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and all of that, this is a bizarre moment. So we get filibusters on everything. We have filibusters on COVID. We have filibusters on immigration reform. We have filibusters on election reform, HR 1. We have filibusters on climate change. Everything that the American public, at least a plurality of it, put Congress in to do, filibuster. So say, is there a possibility you think that those people could shift? And my question also is, what's to stop, if the Democrats don't do it now, what's to stop this Republican Senate from saying, "Woo, we just dodged a bullet. We're going to get rid of the filibuster."
Now we're going to do it, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, so there are a couple of things. First of all, you spoke about COVID relief, and I think people should realize, because it's in the news now, each president, the majority party, gets sort of one shot to get around the filibuster, and it's called the budget reconciliation process. So all this talk about President Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package is not subject to the filibuster because they're going to do it through reconciliation. And there are a lot of other things that they can put in there, maybe not the minimum wage increase, maybe not immigration reform, but it'll be a pretty hefty Christmas tree that will pass with simple majority support. That's my prediction.
So this is an end run around the filibuster anyway, but they get one shot, you're saying,
right,
in a budget bill, basically.
Kim,
we'll call it a budget bill.
I think of it as the movie The Purge, where like one night you get to commit crimes without being arrested. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
But the Republicans and Democrats have each used the reconciliation process to enact a significant part of their agenda. But then you're right. It could be that everything else gets stuck. And at some point, could the frustration level rise enough that even Senators Manchin and Sinema change their position? Sure, Senator Reid changed his position. There were a group of 61 senators, I think, who wrote a letter to the leaders a couple of years ago, 2017, saying, don't change the rules. And now many of them want to change the rules. So politics can get a little bit slippery. Let me answer your question about why should we be confident that McConnell won't do it? I can't be confident. This is, unknowable. But I would observe that President Trump was urging, cajoling in every way for the Republicans, when they've had the majority for the last 4 years, to change the rules, and they didn't. So I don't know whether you want to accept that as a sign of good faith, but they had the chance over the last 4 years and they didn't.
So I want to ask then about January 6th. As you know, my piece today, and I mentioned Hawley and Cruz and how,
Yes.
and of course, impeachment conviction is a supermajority. It's close to impossible. But I think that the argument that, listen, if that was not a basis for conviction, there's no real meaning left to impeachment. My question really is like, I know that you're optimistic, and I like to think hope springs eternal, but what are you thinking now, Ron, about this Congress? Is it able to function anymore? I mean, because
Yes.
people do need legislation. We need legislation. We just do.
I understand. A couple of things. First of all, about January 6th, I want to start out by saying, I know those hallways. I know those rooms. I mean, that fellow with the Confederate flag was running past the office that I had when I worked for Senator Reid. So this pained me enormously. I just can't say enough how awful that was. And certainly it was impeachable, and Trump was impeached, and he should have been convicted. What I don't understand is why there hasn't been more of a movement towards using Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, you've written about this, which provides a mechanism for Congress to disqualify someone who has provided aid and comfort to those who engaged in insurrection. And that would simply be a resolution subject to a majority vote. Now, if filibustered, it would be a 60-vote threshold, but 67 proved to be impossible, and everybody could see that. 60 is not out of the question because we had 57 and several people like Senator McConnell who said the only reason they were voting against impeachment or against conviction was because they thought it wasn't available. Well, that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So I think that is still a mechanism that could be used to provide some accountability. But you're talking beyond that. You're talking about legislation like H.R. 1.
Yeah, just all kinds of stuff that, as you know, I teach a course called Administrative Law, which is about agencies. Agencies get bashed.
I think I assign you to teach that, right?
Yeah, I think you did. Yes,
Yes.
Of course, you do it every year. Regulatory agencies get hammered all the time for having too much power. But part of the reason they have to make all these regulations, and part of the reason that we see presidents use executive orders from Obama to Trump to now to Joe Biden, is because Congress isn't doing the kind of hefty legislative work that it did
Right.
even 20,
Right. No,
30 years ago.
I've seen such a difference. So as I said, I was there in the 90s. I was there in the 2005 to 8 region. And I look at it now, and there's been a dramatic decline in the productivity and effectiveness of the United States Congress, and especially the Senate. So I'm not going to, be all sweetness and light about the Senate. But I guess I want to at least give this Congress a chance. Maybe January 6th shook people up a little bit. So let's take, for example, the Voting Rights Act, which is an element to overturn the Shelby County case, is one element of H.R. 1. And it's a very important piece because the Voting Rights Act needs to be restored. I worked, this is at an earlier stage of my career, when I was a summer intern for Senator Kennedy in 1982, I worked on the Voting Rights Act extension. That bill passed 85 to 15. Right. The most current reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, 2006, passed the Senate unanimously. Now, the Supreme Court throws a monkey wrench in it.
This gets to our Supreme Court point, yeah.
I mean, that's a problem with Supreme Court, and I don't think our Republican appointees, who all got on without, with Democratic support, are going to be any friends of that. But I'd like to see whether Senator Manchin and others could sit down with Republicans and figure out if there's a version of the Voting Rights Act, restoration that could go. Because there has historically been broad bipartisan support. I know it's a different Congress, but you've got to give it a chance. And if 6 months, 8 months, 12 months from now, nothing is moving, then maybe both Senator Manchin and I change our view. But you've got to give it a chance. Let me point out, on COVID relief, Senator Collins assembled 10 senators who said they would negotiate. Now, they came in with too low a number, $600 billion instead of the $1.9 trillion that President Biden wants. But, money is money. Is there something in the $1.3, $1.4 trillion range? And the fact is, it doesn't even matter on that bill because they'll pass that by reconciliation. But if there are 10 senators who are willing to come to the Oval Office and talk to President Biden about compromise, let's get them in a room to talk about the Voting Rights Act and about voter protections and climate change. Is it impossible? I want to see that it's impossible before I change my mind.
Okay, so you're open to changing your mind, but your hope springs eternal. Let me ask you, presumably you've worked with President Biden. What are your thoughts? Do you think he, first of all, is going to potentially be able, as many people hope, to bring some sense of bipartisanship back based on his, that's my first question, based on his personal connections over so many years?
Well, first of all, can we have a little point of UB pride that then Vice President Biden was one of the speakers when we opened our law school building in 2013. So we know him well. I did work with him when he was a senator, and then I saw him as vice president. And I do believe he knows the Senate as well as any had been served as majority leader. And you'd have to go back pretty far before that to find another senator to find another president who understands the Senate as well and understands the chemistry of the Senate. Senator Kennedy used to talk about the chemistry of the Senate, the sort of alchemy that makes it work or not. So if anybody can do it, it's Biden. But I don't know that he can. We've become so polarized, and the Republican Party has become so extreme and in many ways irrational. I don't know that it can work. All I'm saying is you got to give it a chance before you blow the place up, which is what the nuclear option is. And I just worry that we would live to regret it. At this moment, we may think it advantageous, but 5 years, 10 years, there's going to be a Republican president in the future. There's going to be a Republican majority in the Senate in the future. And when those things come together, if we don't have the filibuster, you watch. They will defund Planned Parenthood. They will repeal the Affordable Care Act. Who knows what the issues of the day will be, but a lot of bad things will happen. And the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett is, kind of a canary in the coal mine.
Well, that's a really sobering, you might have brought me to your side of things, actually, because that is a terrifying prospect. I think that, and I say that because there's 100% chance that will happen. I mean, we've seen, all these predictions that that'll never happen. That's out the window. Worst case scenarios are happening in American democracy right now.
And back to something we were discussing a moment ago about the nature of the Senate. It actually is skewed towards Republican.
Can you explain that? Because we started with that, and I think it's really important. I didn't really understand this until I kind of dug into my voting book. Can you explain? So how is it that more, the majority of the population could not be reflected in the majority of the Senate?
Right. Well, it goes back to high school civics as we understand the Senate. It was created under what I think is called the Connecticut Compromise because the delegates to the Constitutional Convention from Connecticut proposed it. Some people wanted population-based representation. Others wanted the states as sovereign to be represented in the national legislature. And they said, well, let's have bicameralism. There is precedent from the English Parliament. And so the Senate is not representative of the people, it's representative of states. And since states have different populations, the Senate does not have, one man, one vote. And increasingly, the population is based on the coast. There are more and more people in New York and California, and that's where the Democratic senators are from. Fewer and fewer people from North Dakota and Wyoming, where there tend to be Republican senators. And so more and more, there's a Republican tilt to the Senate. And so if we're concerned about a Republican majority, and we would want the filibuster to hold off bad legislation, we need to be especially concerned as North Dakota shrinks and California grows.
So the idea is, if I live in North Dakota, I'm a voter in North Dakota, my role, my voice in the Senate is little, and dozens of times as someone from California. So the Californians' voice is small. And so can you also explain, from all many years, how is the Senate, just in terms of its power, and I know this is high school civics, but as you know, only a third of Americans can name the three branches of government.
Yeah,
so how is it, why is it so particularly important, or for senators? I mean, that is, what's the role of the Senate as compared to the role of the House? I mean, I would argue it has more powers in a way than the House of Representatives.
Well, it has some constitutional powers that the House doesn't have: ratifying treaties, confirming presidential appointments. So Judges. It's important in that way. Also, just because there are 100 of them as opposed to 435 House members, each senator has more power. And because of the rules of the Senate, what we were talking about with the power of debate and the minority power that's created by the filibuster, each senator has more power. Look, the famous story, maybe apocryphal, that Thomas Jefferson comes back from Paris and sits down with George Washington and says, what are we doing here? And what is the Senate about? And Washington says, well, why do you pour your tea in the saucer to cool it? And Jefferson says, well, that's why I do it, to cool it. And Washington says, just so. So the Senate was supposed to cool the passions of the people. It's why it's intended to be deliberative. But having said that, and it's all kind of part of the myth of the Senate and of American history, it's beyond cooling. There's been terrible abuse of the filibuster. And while I support the filibuster, I want to see reforms to it.
Yeah, so can we talk about that? Because, I don't want to leave people depressed, right? And that is, I mean, how do we fix, I mean, gerrymandering is another topic. Gerrymandering is one way to fix the representation in the House, or add more members to the House, because that's statutorily required, not like the Senate. But how do we fix the filibuster, and is there anything we can do short of a constitutional amendment to fix this problem with the lack of fair representation in the Senate? The idea that if you're in a less populous state, if you are in a rural state, you have more power in government than people in cities. That's the bottom line. Yeah,
it's true. Well, how about a constitutional convention? Do we want that?
Well, Justice Scalia said that's the worst idea he's ever heard, and I'm paraphrasing. He's like,
it's scary.
This is not the century to do that.
Right, it's scary. But there can be reforms of the filibuster itself. Let's focus on that. For one thing, we were saying before, make them talk. Majority leaders can insist that if you're going to have a filibuster, we're going to stay up all night. And if you stop talking, we're going to call the question.
Would that require a rule change, Ron?
No, that's practice.
So let's walk through the scenario. Say the Democrats now are controlling. Chuck Schumer says, you know what, no more of this just, lazy way of triggering the filibuster where you just say, I'm filibustering, and you go home. How could he change that?
Well, he could keep the Senate in session overnight and say, because what they do now is they adjourn for the night and come back to vote on the cloture petition in 2 days. Or they go on to other business. But a majority leader could choose to stay on the question, and let's say it's a very important bill, maybe a climate change bill or the Voting Rights Act, and say, we're going to stay on this and debate it. And those of you who are not going to allow us to proceed to a vote on final passage are going to have to talk. And then
why don't they do that? That's brilliant, Ron. I mean, I haven't really heard anyone articulate it that way. Why doesn't Chuck Schumer just say, listen, folks, if you want to filibuster, bring it on. Otherwise, we're just going to, we're going to vote. Like, you need to either debate or not, but I'm not going to let you do it this easy way anymore.
So then Schumer tries to call the question, and someone on the other side stands up and says, "I object."
Okay.
And then, you know, it should trigger debate, but in practice, what happens is the majority realizes that someone is willing to talk, and so they accept that as enough.
So the
And
Democrats would have to be willing to do an all-nighter.
right, and they all go home, or they all go to their fundraisers.
Right. So that's the fundraisers. That's the creep, right? They'd have to say, listen,
And
it's
a
more
little
important.
bit, it's a little bit of a wink between the parties because they all want to get out of there to do what other things, or to go home, or to see their families. So they all kind of let it slide like that. There have been times when majority leaders have forced debate, but you know, if people are willing to stand up, and since Jimmy Stewart was doing it by himself, the way it would typically have, and someone speaks for an hour and then passes the floor to the next person who speaks for an hour, or passes the next person. There are limits on how often you can speak in a legislative day. Some of this is very technical, but you could force more. So one reform, and this would be a reform to practice, not the rule, would be to make them talk. You also could limit the availability of the filibuster. It doesn't, right now, it's on every question, including amendments, including the motion to proceed to a bill. And so you could have a rules change. Maybe it would be nuclear, or maybe there would be a negotiation where both parties agree that the filibuster should only be available on certain questions. Now, we're past this on nominations, but one obvious point there was keep the supermajority for Supreme Court and maybe Court of Appeals nominees, but not for the district court. I mean, that's just not weighty enough to justify that. And then Senator Harkin, the former senator from Iowa, had an interesting idea. Now, this gets away from the 60-vote threshold. But he said, if it's about calling attention to an issue, all right, so the first cloture vote is 60, and then you wait 2 days after debate, come back to it, and the next cloture vote is 57, the third cloture vote is 54, and then finally you get to the simple majority of 51. So it was a clever idea that worked with the math of the Senate to say eventually let the cutoff be a simple majority, but give people a real chance to talk and debate and call attention to an issue of importance.
So they're just hanging on to get to the 50,
Yeah,
but they're not necessarily.
It wouldn't stop the bills that we want to pass that might, you know, be important, but it would slow it down and allow public attention to focus on it, and maybe then it changes the outcome on final passage.
Which is really what they should be doing.
Yeah,
in the
that's what it
fundraising
really should be about.
But so like, I'm just trying to think of our polarized Congress right now. Now, say we have two sides that really, one hates a bill, one loves a bill. Is that another face-off where the Democrats are like, listen, Mitch McConnell's going to keep his caucus, and they're going to beat us. Yeah. They're going to be up all night for weeks. But I mean,
you know what
is that holding that down, or do you think it's enough people are like, listen, I don't care enough about this. Let's just move on.
One of the flaws in the way people view the Senate, in my view, is that you think of it as the Democrats want this and the Republicans want that. They're individuals, and they each have their own politics. I mean, Joe Manchin's West Virginia politics are very different from Kristen Gillibrand's New York politics, or Ben Cardin's Maryland politics. And so it's not going to be like that. What's going to happen over time is you hope that the more moderate Democrats find the more moderate Republicans and find a way to move forward on some of these, even the polarized questions. That's the way it's supposed to work. I think about Senator Kennedy, who always found a Republican to work with. He worked with Bob Dole on the Americans with Disabilities Act. He worked with Al Simpson to get immigration reform in the 80s. He worked with Orrin Hatch on many health care bills. And he did that because he knew that was the way to get progress in the Senate. It overcame the filibuster because there were Republicans, and Hatch and Simpson brought along some of their colleagues for the proposal, the compromise version. It wasn't everything that Kennedy wanted, but he said, let's take half a loaf, let's move the football down the field.
Yeah, and so we have a question in the chat then. Why aren't your common sense, totally legitimate, persuasive suggestions for a non-nuclear option fix to the filibuster? Why aren't they doing it?
Well, I'm not there. I came up to Baltimore to be your dean, Kim.
I know, but you were there for a long time.
No,
so I'm going to make you guess.
That was, I want to emphasize, that was a joke. It would not have changed if I were there. I mean, staffers, have a voice, but not that big a voice. I don't know. This is intangible about why the Senate doesn't work. Why we don't have people who see the big picture anymore. I think about the statesmen of the past. Not, I could say Senator Kennedy, but I'd add, people like Senator Dole, Jacob Javits from New York, Howard Baker from Tennessee, Phil Hart from Michigan, people who were statesmen in the Senate and were able to do the business that the American people wanted them to do, working together, finding compromise, finding common ground. Somehow it's a lost art now. I know that there were many senators who want to get back to that. They can't seem to find their way out of the darkness.
Yeah, so last question, and this is really for our students or people in that sort of age bracket or demographic. I mean, we have a whole range, but those that are starting this career in the law, how should they think about this? Like, what can people do in their regular lives? I mean, you talked to, and you know, I'm a big devotee to civic education.
Right.
I mean, if you had 2 or 3 takeaways for people that they could take to, you know, their next Zoom call, because we don't actually have coffee anymore, at least for now. What would it be, Ron, to say, I know this is a bleak picture, but you're the next generation of lawyers and politicians. This is how you should think about these things moving forward.
Well, you wrote a book about the importance of voting. I mean, that's fundamental here. Because if you want to change the Senate, you want to change senators. I mean, one thing that happened in this last election, even as Joe Biden won the presidency, is Republicans picked up seats in the House and came close to holding the Senate. In the end, they didn't. So votes count, and some of those races were darn close, and that's fundamental for everybody. For our law students, you know, I want them to understand these issues. I want them to understand the history. How did we get here? What are the respective roles of the court? How does this fit into the constitutional structure? You know, the filibuster is just one of the ways in which our system slows things down. I mean, look at bicameralism. You don't have to have 2 houses of Congress. The veto, you know, is another mechanism. It's a check and balance. So our students need to understand how all this fits in, and then work towards reform, work towards advocacy. Maybe one lesson is to try to find someone who doesn't agree with you and have coffee with them when we can have coffee, and just talk and see if we can find some common ground. Some of the best conversations I've ever had are with Republicans I work with in the Senate, you know, staffers I work with. I went to the Justice Department, and there were many career officials there who were more conservative than me. And it was good to talk with them and try and see where we could agree and see how, you know, we might together advocate for some changes that would improve our democracy.
And there's, you know, I think your concept of the statesman, that's the kind of politician you might want to vote for too, or support, right? Not the people on either end, but the one that's willing to have the coffee and change their mind and respect a different point of view.
Isn't it great? You and I know this. Some of our students go on to elected positions, mostly in Annapolis as state legislators, but we have Dutch Ruppersberger in the Congress. But I'm so proud of our students who enter the arena like that and play a role either as the elected official or as staff or in some other important public role. And it's the next generation. That's why we do what we do. We're trying to prepare the next generation for the battles ahead. But take the long view. Take the long view and realize at the moment it may seem like filibuster, you know, explosions make sense, but let's look at history and see what makes sense for the long term.
Well, I've learned a lot, and we're getting all kinds of hearts and even compliments on the COVID beard. I should pass along.
Whoever liked my beard, thank you very much.
And there was a very practical question. Do you know of any handy guide, like how to read the Constitution and why, when it comes to Senate procedure, or is that that's for experts like you?
No. There were certainly books. Well, first of all, your books on the Constitution and voting are quite excellent. You know, let me think about that, and can I let you know when you can put that in?
Yeah, I can post it, or we can. I can.
What I'm thinking is, I mean, a fellow just wrote a book. There's actually another staffer for Senator Reid named Adam Gentleson. Who wrote a book advocating for the abolition of the filibuster. So I'm loath to recommend that, but he's a smart guy and he's got a lot to say. Right. You know, Robert Caro, in his biography of Lyndon Johnson, Master of the Senate, one in the series, writes quite favorably about the filibuster. And that's a timeless work that everybody who's interested in this should read. I'll come up with a couple of others and I'll pass them on to you.
Well, it's, I mean, I think probably what people need to know, they can just rewatch this, which we will put it on my Instagram, we'll put it on YouTube and maybe even on one of the UB sites. But anyway, thank you so much, Dean Weich, and thank you for our students and others who are watching that took their time out of their midterms to learn about the Constitution.
No, thank you, Kim. This is great. And I just want to say again, we're so proud of what you've done, because key to this is public education. In so many ways, you've taken the lead on that. And we are enormously proud of that.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. This is Simple Politics with Kim Wehle. Good night, everybody. Have a terrific evening. Thanks again, Ron Weich. Bye now.